right, Mo, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really excited to have this conversation. So I stumbled upon Mo or Dr. H on TikTok and was just fascinated by some of his ideas. And Mo is an emergency physician based in the UK. And we started talking a little bit just now about epigenetics and about how you think people really have a misunderstanding of how disease and illness works. I'm wondering if you could give your little spiel on epigenetics and how people actually get sick.
I thank you for inviting me. I'm very happy to be here. I think so. There's a bit of a problem in healthcare in general, especially around research. And I think because it's been happening for so long and it's developed so well since the 60s, we've developed into silos essentially. And I think
Mm.
it's very easy to discover a groundbreaking discovery and prove it as a scientist for it to just disappear for 10 or 20 years. And I think that's what
Right.
happened with epigenetics. I think it was officially proven in the late 90s or early 2000s. And just to give you a bit of a background on what epigenetics is. So epigenetics is basically the ability of so your environment changing your genetic output, let's say. So
Yeah.
there are two ways. There are two ways to manipulate genetics. The first one is genetic engineering, of course, where you change the actual sequence, and then therefore you have different proteins produced, and then a different body. So you've got that, and then you've got epigenetics, where you can just switch genes on and off, so the code doesn't translate into proteins or into real life
Ah,
physical properties. Do you know what I mean? So
yeah.
theoretically, if you have full understanding of epigenetics and you've got access to every chemical in the world, theoretically, you can achieve the same result you would with genetic engineering by using epigenetics. So actually, it's not
Wow.
a it's a really big discovery. You know, this is as big as evolutionary biology. Do you know what I mean? Because actually, some people do argue that it's even bigger than evolutionary biology because it has
Right.
almost immediate implications for our lives and our kids, our parents' lives, because evolution is long term, right? So you have to wait 10, 20 generations to see an effect. Whereas epigenetics is literally almost like genetic engineering. So it's your kids, it's your grandkids, all that. So it's actually, you know, once that was proven, all of science really needed to be redone, or at least all of new science from that point forward needed to account for that in their conclusions, which of course never happened because we're so siloed. And this is just one example. There are many in science.
Yeah.
So when I made that realization, I basically, you know, when you realize that epigenetics is a big deal, of course, the next thing you do is look for the influences on epigenetics, right? So you've got the
Right.
social trauma stuff, of course, and then
Okay.
you've got all the chemicals that we've been exposed to, and the rest is history, really. Once you realize that we've been exposed to a distinct set of chemicals, you know, every 100 or 200 years, for thousands of years, you quickly come to the realization that there's no disease really. There's no genetic disease. It's very rare, let's say. So 99% or more of all endemic disease that we suffer from today is can be traced directly to a specific chemical or two.
Okay. So this would really make sense why when you look at historical documentation, like I'm a big history nerd. I love reading, old documents and historians' interpretations of things. And I've often noticed when you read something that's like, say, from the 1800s or from the 1500s or from the 300s or whatever, when you go back, illness does seem to manifest very differently, like the kinds of diseases and illnesses people are describing people getting, like they don't really match up to what we see today. So this, it sounds like, is what you're saying, that there's no necessarily like discrete just diseases that just exist outside of our environment, that illnesses are in fact an interplay between us and our environment. Is that right? Would you expand on that?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, as far as we know, because we don't have the ability to look at the physiology or the pathophysiology of someone from 20,000 years ago. So we go back
Yeah.
to the Egyptians era, so the Bronze era, and they do have this. They do have some overlap with our conditions, and they have
Yeah.
distinct ones. And the problem with history is people neglect the numbers. So if you've got 10% of the population who suffer from, let's say, autoimmune disease today, right? And there was evidence maybe of autoimmune disease during the Egyptian era, right? 10% compared to like 0.1% is a big
Okay.
difference, right?
Right.
So you've got the numbers as well. So you have the prevalence or incidence and the type of disease. And I think people forget that. So the vast majority of people, when you argue that cardiovascular disease is caused by something new in the environment, um, they'd say, actually, well, if you look at mummified remains from Egyptian mummies, they do have signs of cardiovascular disease in their arteries. But do you know what I mean? In the 1960s, 6% of 90-year-olds or 85-year-olds were dying from cardiovascular disease every year. You were losing
Okay.
6% of 85-year-olds on a yearly basis around the 1960s. That probably did not happen to the Egyptians, right? So
Right.
it's not enough to just look at history and take a snapshot and assume. People just assume too much, I think. Yeah, so
Yeah,
I
yeah.
digress there.
Yeah, yeah, no, this is so fascinating. I mean, so, the genes are still there, but it's so modulated by the environment that something that the environment would trigger 0.1% of the population to have happen may then in another era trigger 10 or 20% of the population to have. So, I mean,
Yes.
this really blows out of the water this genetic idea of disease that you come down with a condition because I don't know if you see, I'm sure you see this in the medical field that people have this attitude that things like autoimmune disease is just genetic. You just get it, and that's just your lot in life, and you just have to take medications and deal with it. Um, yeah, I mean, I guess I'm curious what you think uh, is the potential for reversing these kinds of, and we want to be careful with the words obviously because legally like saying things like curing is off the table, but
Mhm.
if these genes are turned on, so to speak, what do you think about the science of then turning those genes back off potentially?
It's a very good question, and this is why I talk a lot about epigenetics, because the only way we're going to find out is if everybody realizes that the entire scientific community actually take that on board and start looking
Yeah.
into it, because the vast majority of scientists right now are still looking into genetics. Some are looking
Yeah.
into genetics with a view of controlling them through epigenetics, of course, but
Yeah.
I think you know we need more research for autoimmune conditions.
Yeah.
For example, if we get the equivalent of Ozempic for autoimmune conditions, you pretty much okay, because so far Ozempic's looking like it's solving cardiovascular disease, stroke, potentially some cancers, chronic kidney disease. That's an entire spectrum of human disease right now, endemic human disease, right? Because cardiovascular disease is the biggest killer. Obesity
Yeah.
affects 30% of people or 25%. Type 2 diabetes is endemic. So if you can cure all these with Ozempic, then the other side of the spectrum, you've got autoimmune disease. And
Right.
all we need is an Ozempic for autoimmune disease now, I think. So we're close. And the thing about humans, especially modern sciences, um, it's not very effective or efficient at least, but we're not terrible at creating treatments for conditions that we don't understand for some reason.
Right.
And that tends to
Yeah.
happen very often, much often than people think. In fact, when we understand the disease and come up with a strategy to isolate the therapeutic target and then attack it and all that, those trials don't tend to work. It's
Okay.
usually the
Interesting.
lucky, like the antibiotics, it was pure luck, for example. Um,
Right.
Prednisolone, again, I think there was an element of luck there. Aspirin, I think, was a plant. It was a part of
Yeah.
herbal medicine to begin with. So so if you were able to cure cardiovascular disease maybe with Ozempic by luck, then it's quite possible that you can do it with autoimmune disease too. In fact, there's a possibility that the drug already exists and just needs repurposing.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, it is possible. I mean, I don't know if this is the point exactly you're making, but, the problem is maybe that we're not going to keep looking into the epigenetic level as much because we may just be able to mask these epigenetic changes through medications that we discover, and many people have for other conditions. But I know for you, and maybe for me, like the curiosity, and wanting to get to the root of like, why is this happening in the first place? Because there's always the people that the medications don't work for. A lot of the clients
Mhm.
that I have, they may be in such a state of autoimmune or allergic reactivity that they can't even tolerate taking medications, right? They're at that kind of stage of it, or they have they get every adverse side effect it's
Absolutely.
possible to get, right? There's always those people. And you were talking a little bit before we started recording about how you started even just getting interested, and it really sounded like you have this naturally curious mind, like you were making some observations in your practice, but then in your personal life too. So maybe we can kind of go back to the story of how you kind
Yeah.
of opened your mind from being this kind of conventional emergency room physician to exploring some of these avenues. Do you want to share a bit about that?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Just before we move on to that,
Yeah.
um, you know, what you said about alternative medicine, the reason why it's important, or
Yeah.
the reason why it's got a lot of demand right now, and its purpose in general, it's basically filling the gap that
Yeah.
the lag in medicine. Because now that we know
Right.
epigenetics means the biology isn't constant intergenerationally, there's always a perpetual gap where science is not there yet, but there are young people who
Yeah.
are sick. And I think that's even worse in our generations. But yeah, I
Yes,
just wanted to touch on that because I think it's important.
absolutely.
And in terms of yeah, as I said, you probably had a very similar experience to me. It wasn't personal, my experience. I wasn't sick myself, but as you know, I'm an emergency physician, right? And I think emergency physicians are slightly different to every other specialty because we've got very little time, and we have to make up our minds quickly, and very little in terms of investigations at our disposal. So we
Yeah.
have to rely on it's. There's a lot more detective work and ruling
Okay.
out
Yeah.
ruling out probable conditions, or second, the whole differential of diagnoses. You've got like 10, maybe 15 blood tests, X-ray, CT, an ultrasound, which is not much in an hour or two.
Right.
So you develop this um, sort of observational detective work, and over years you start noticing things that probably other people don't notice. You've also got the advantage of having a very diverse sample, so your patients
Right.
are all kinds of ages, all kinds of problems. Every specialty has an emergency, or a bunch of emergency conditions that so you end
Yeah.
up seeing a lot of specialties, whereas an immunologist will see like the same type of disease, with one or two main diseases, and everything else they'll see rarely. So there's that. So you
Right.
get a big sample, and over time, I think about 3 or 4 years ago, I realized that there was something not right. Like people look different. Like people
Mm.
don't look like their parents anymore. I don't know if you've noticed that, especially the younger generations. I noticed that the diseases that they were coming with were entirely different, including mental health conditions. There was a difference in numbers, so it was very clear that the younger patients had more autoimmune conditions or allergies. Um,
Mm-hmm.
what else? The facial bone structure was different. That was the biggest clue
Mm.
for me, as I said to you before. Also, I used to commute quite a lot, so I'd people watch sometimes on the trains. And again,
Yeah.
same thing. Wherever you went, train, bus, um, car, taxi, people just look different in every generation.
Yeah.
Um, and I think I just, yeah, basically I kept seeing those signs. I couldn't ignore them anymore. And I just went
Yeah.
on a deep dive one day, and I linked it all together, and I found the link to some of the microplastics, the estrogenic microplastics from the 50s and 60s. And then when that happened, so that triggered everything. When that happened,
Yeah.
I realized that I need to find the baseline. I need to find when were people actually well in themselves, if plastics been around since the 50s. And the more I kept looking back, the more I realized that that doesn't exist. There's no baseline. There's no
Okay.
normal human, because we've never been not influenced by the environment, especially
Sure.
during lead. So for 2,000 years, we were exposed to combustible or combustion products from hydrocarbons, coal, for example, and lead, right? Heavy metals. So that's 2,000
Right.
years of exposure. So you can't really rule out that these heavy metals weren't behind all the conditions you read about in history if we've been exposed for 2,000 years, right? And then you look back even further, and then it's copper instead of lead, and antimony. And so to me, it became very obvious that really, apart from a minority of conditions, there's no disease that's caused by genetics or your behavior or whatever. So it was clear to me that it was all the environment. And the other thing is, logically speaking, it's been like 20 years since we've mapped the genome, the Human Genome Project.
Hmm.
I don't know when it was done, but we've mapped the whole genome, right? So if there were
Yeah.
conditions with all the AI and technology that we have, if they were all genetic, we would have figured it out by now, right? It's
Right.
been a long time.
Yeah.
So
What a letdown that was. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. I mean, I think another very important distinction to make is that when people think of a condition or like cardiovascular disease or lupus, for example, yes, there are genetic components, but it's not like 30, 50, 30, 20, for example. It's not like 30% of conditions are caused by a genetic component, another 30 of lupus is caused by what you eat, and another 30 is caused by your environment. No, when they say that,
Yeah.
it usually means there's a primary cause, a secondary cause, and a tertiary cause. Okay?
Ah,
And the reason why that's important is because if you remove the primary cause, you don't need to worry about the secondary and tertiary. So if you, for
interesting.
example, get exposed to plastics, and that's the
Yeah.
primary cause, and then your genetics determine what kind of autoimmune disease you get. So you and I get exposed to
Right.
plastics. You develop lupus, I develop like Sjogren's, for example, right,
Right.
because of our genetics. And then our diet, a trauma can trigger it as well. So I don't
Yeah.
get exposed to trauma, you get exposed to trauma, my Sjogren's gets better, your lupus worsens, for example, or gets triggered
Right.
altogether, right? So that's what it
Hmm.
means. But the point is, if you remove the plastics, nobody gets anything, right? We don't get lupus or
Right.
Sjogren's. And that's the
Right.
distinction that people need to start making: primary, secondary, tertiary, not 30, 30, 30.
Yes. Oh my gosh, there's so much I want to dig into. First of all, I do want to just ask you, um, have you looked into research on the health of certain indigenous cultures that have never gotten into metalworking, for example, like never gotten into industrialized civilization? Because that might be, I have a mentor who has traveled the world, like trying to spend time with and study the health of certain indigenous tribes, who have never become industrialized, never become farmers. And her experience with them is that their health is so different than anyone in the industrialized world, um, that that might potentially be our only baseline. And those communities are so far removed and have gone through their own, obviously, thousands of years of adaptation, from people who have adopted a more industrialized society. So, yeah, I don't know if you have any reflections on that or if you looked into that at all.
I tried for a while, um, but there's just not enough data. Like to find
Yeah,
data, you'd have to do what your professor did: is actually literally travel there,
right,
form a relationship, and then study the whole situation. And
right,
they will still be exposed to something today if they live today,
right.
regardless of where they are, because it's just
Interesting.
everything's just
Yeah.
so
Hmm.
polluted. So
Right.
I'd love to do something like that, but I haven't been able to, of course. The other thing I did
Yeah.
was photos. I
Oh,
basically found I looked at um, graduation photos from the 1920s, 1910s in Western
oh,
Europe.
wow.
And then I tried to find some tribal photos, but again, it was very, very difficult. I did find
Yeah.
differences. I did find differences in bone structure, which gave me some clues, but it wasn't enough to like dig into, if you know what I mean.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Did you look at Weston A Price's photos at all? His dental photos? Do you know who that is?
No, I don't think so.
Oh, you should dig into this. So Weston A. Price is a dentist who lived in like the 1920s, 1930s, and he actually did travel and take a lot of pictures of different tribes, and he was looking at their teeth, their dental formation and their jaw formation. So that
Mm.
might be something really fascinating for you to dig into to further your research.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
a good point actually. I went down the jawline route, which is
Yeah.
basically the same thing, right? Overcrowding
Yeah.
is kind of a jawline
Right.
problem or a jaw problem, but it would be fascinating to look at. Thank you for that. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so maybe we can just kind of like go slowly back in time, starting with the plastics and the 60s.
Mhm.
So it sounds like the biggest shift that you saw, and sounds like mostly related to cardiovascular health is what you were looking at, was the introduction of plastics into the environment. Would you just
No,
expand on that a bit?
so I think cardiovascular disease, I only recently dug into. I think that's
Okay.
because of that's more heavy metals and
Okay.
sort of solvents and combustible hydrocarbons and volatile hydrocarbons. So that's more that. The plastics is autoimmune disease, more likely,
Okay.
I think,
Okay.
because the timing there, autoimmune disease really escalated in the 70s onwards,
Interesting.
and it's still getting more prevalent in younger generations. So Gen Z are the most
Yeah.
affected. So it would, I'd say it's either the plastics or one of the pesticides, I think. Maybe a few even.
So can you talk a little bit about any theories as to the mechanism going on with the plastics and how they're affecting the immune system?
Yeah, I think my personal theory is that the majority of the effect happens before you're born. Um,
Okay.
some of it is transgenerational as well. So I think they can cross the placenta. They're lipophilic, especially BPA, so they can dissolve in fatty tissue, so they can get into the brain very easily. Traverse the blood-brain
Okay.
barrier and the placenta. And once they're in, they basically function like estrogens. And you know the immune system is very reliant on estrogens and androgens for
Okay.
correct programming, especially the thymus gland. So the thymus is where all your T cells and all your white cells, basically the immune system fighting cells, they get trained in the thymus gland, and the ones that are not good at self-regulating or recognizing the self-antigens get destroyed over time. So it's a training process. It's a filtering process.
Okay.
There's a lot that happens there. That's just an example, but the thymus, I think, is heavily involved here. And then you've got the adrenal glands, or the whole HPA axis, and that's again massively involved because the adrenals make cortisol, adrenaline, and the sex hormones as well, or the precursors to some of the
Yes.
sex hormones and the androgens. So that's what went wrong. I think all of that is somehow
Okay.
affected. You get shifted to one side or the other, away from the center almost, just for explanation purposes. And I think when that happens, um, it lowers the threshold of developing an autoimmune disease, so that then when you experience a normal trauma or a mild to moderate trauma, you have a higher risk of developing the autoimmune disease. I think that's the easiest way to explain it.
Yeah, yeah, it makes so much sense. And what I have and what a lot of my clients have specifically is mast cell activation syndrome. I don't know
Mm.
how much you've seen this
Oh
in
yeah.
your practice. It's becoming a lot more common, unfortunately, in recent years. And there is a huge connection between estrogen and mast cell activation.
Mm-hmm.
And so a lot of people, and it's not all, but primarily women who get this condition, and there seems to be a big connection between the hormone cycle and when their symptoms flare. And there's a huge link between hormonal issues and primarily estrogen dominance and these immune conditions. And this is fitting exactly in with what you're saying. If we are getting this influx of estrogenic molecules into our environment, is disrupting this whole balance that, of course, affects the hormones, and you're going to get all this like PMS symptoms and endometriosis and like all these kinds of things, but you're also going to get this disruption in the immune system through that mechanism. Am I getting that correctly, you think?
Yes, absolutely. You're absolutely right. The challenge is how much of it is actually in life exposure, like right now,
Yes.
and how much of it is your sort of estrogen androgen baseline level programming before you were born
From
in the
birth.
uterus from
Yeah.
birth. That's the
Okay.
challenge, I think. And the other challenge here is, yes, the immune system and sex hormones. This is a massively understudied area of medicine,
Okay.
and I'm not really sure why. I feel like this is where all everybody should be focusing, because there's clearly a
Okay.
massive relationship between sex hormones, gut microbiome, and immune system.
Yeah.
But I think because we are too hasty with therapeutics, one of the mistakes I think we did, apart from the silos, is we didn't stay top level long enough. So
Mm.
we were top level at the beginning when autoimmune disease became a problem, and then everyone was like, "Oh, it's the hygiene hypothesis, of course." And then we went top down, so we went down too early, and we started looking for therapeutics too early, and there
Right.
weren't enough people looking at the top level stuff. So even I mean, I graduated in about just under 10 years ago, and I
Hmm.
was taught about the hygiene hypothesis back then, which is, I think,
Right.
ridiculous. That's in the 2010s, you know.
Right.
So yeah, um, I think that's one of the problems. But yes, there's definitely a relationship there. I think a lot of
Yeah.
people in alternative medicine or functional medicine know that very well,
Yeah.
and many of whom
Yeah.
are doctors, like graduated doctors who have specialized in GP
Right.
and that.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, a lot of times people will talk about, okay, well, let's lower our exposure to these as much as possible. Like, let's start wearing more natural fiber clothing, let's reduce our use of all these conventional cleaning and hygiene products. Let's stop drinking water out of plastic bottles, all this stuff. And that's all probably a good idea, of course. But what I'm hearing you say is that it may be not necessarily triggered by that exposure in our lifetime, we may actually now, enough generations in, be just having a baseline disruption because of what is being programmed on a maternal level. Is that what I'm
Yes.
hearing?
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
that's exactly it. That's not to say that actually there's a lot of intervention, successful intervention that can be
Okay.
done from a psychological perspective. So I've seen
Okay.
a lot of people, probably not the majority, but a lot of people are able to reverse many autoimmune symptoms using mindfulness, for example, or any other psychological intervention that suits them. There's always, in medicine, we say there's a rule of thirds. So a third can do that, and then another third, can do it through herbal medicine. And then you've got another third, unfortunately, that will require medication. For the people
Right.
who, I know a lot of people in this community are sort of terrified of meds because of hypersensitivity to medications
Yeah.
and unusual side effects and all that sort of stuff. But you have to sometimes think to yourself that if the problem was caused by significant, pollutant or heavy metal or chemical exposure, then it's not unreasonable to require medicines to fix it, to require another
Sure.
medicine to fix it. So just it's important, I think, to keep that option open in the back of your mind
Yeah.
if things don't go your way,
Yeah.
functionally or psychologically.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of the folks that come to me, and I was this way too, like I used to medicate when I was very, very ill. And I've recovered since then, but when I was very, very ill, I absolutely used medications to modulate my histamine responses and things like that because I couldn't do any other interventions unless I had that baseline stabilization. So I appreciate you bringing that up. Like just because we're trying to look outside Western medicine doesn't mean Western medicine has nothing to offer. Sometimes it can give us that initial stabilization. But it sounds like you are also saying that you think even if some of these imbalances may have been programmed from birth, we may be able to use mind body techniques or maybe herbal interventions that still can help modulate those levels.
Absolutely, I think so. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
The level of success will depend on you as a patient and what
Yeah.
specific condition you have and how aggressive the condition is in terms of how it progresses. So it will be,
Yeah.
a case by case basis, but definitely it's entirely possible. Yeah, more than possible.
Do you have any, this is just like, like you may have no idea, but if we like cut off the production of microplastics like today, do you have any just like hypothesis on how many generations it would take to like work that out of our system? Like how far, down the tunnel are we?
I think I think we're never going to cut it off because every time we
Yeah.
cut something. So the trend is at the moment with every generation we are cutting down on the heavier chemicals, but we're introducing lighter ones, and then we're finding out a generation later that actually the next generation is so the lighter chemicals are yes less
Okay.
toxic, but they do have some toxicity. So it's going the right way in the sense that we are cutting down the heavy polluters that are really toxic to humans,
Yeah.
but we're still being exposed to something right now. So the next generation will have
Continue.
some sort of
Something
something
new.
new,
Yeah.
or a different form of an old condition, at least a different pattern of
Yeah.
symptoms. But it's all going in the right direction, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Can
that's not to
speaking
say
of,
that.
go
Sorry,
ahead.
I was just going to say, all it would take, as I said, is something like Ozempic or the next generation of Ozempic for that. So you don't necessarily have to end the plastics or the. I know it's the right thing to do, But even if we don't, with
Yeah,
the right medication, there are ways to manage it and have a completely normal life, basically. So
it
it
could be a
might be that
solution.
that comes first. I
Yeah.
don't know.
I love your optimism. Honestly, it's refreshing. Yeah. Um, Speaking of lighter toxicants, can we talk about aluminum? So I often run these hair tests where I will test the hair of my clients to look for minerals and toxicants. And the one I see the most extremely elevated in my clients is aluminum over and over and over and over again. And um, it tends to be in people who are having some of the more stubborn neurological symptoms. And I was just wondering if you've done any research on aluminum and how this fits into your whole hypothesis.
I haven't actually because
Okay.
um, it's to me, I know aluminum, cadmium, and sort of manganese. They always tend to be found together in
Yeah.
certain areas. So you've got usually it's like automotive industry or
Yeah.
coal mining or sort of materials, chemical companies, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And they usually come together. So it's very hard to kind of delineate which one's causing what condition. But actually,
Right.
now that you bring
Right.
it up, it'll be very interesting to know. Maybe we can talk about that later as well, if you want. It will be interesting to know what conditions you've managed to correlate with aluminium, what kind of symptoms at least, and then maybe I can dig into that.
Yeah, yeah, no, I would love you're obviously got a gift for research, but yeah, it tends to be neuropathy, like both pain and numbness in the nerves, like burning, tingling kind of sensations in the nerves. A lot of migraines, vertigo, dizziness, just overall a lot of neurological imbalance, like kind of vague but debilitating neurological symptoms. And that's not all of it. I've seen it in people who have allergic symptoms too. But that seems to be the thing because I will run these tests when I feel like I get, into a when I get stuck with someone, especially with some of those neurological symptoms, it can be tough to address. And I'm telling you, again and again, they've
Mm,
got a huge amount of aluminum coming out. It's just an interesting pattern I've seen.
yeah, that is interesting. Is there a specific area geographically that you've found they come from?
No, I mean, I mostly work with people in the US.
Hmm.
But I mean, it's a big country. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's all over the US. Yeah.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll have to look into that.
Well, maybe we can go back in time a little bit and talk more about the heavy metals. Do you want to
Yeah.
share a bit about your research into that and how those seem to affect the body?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people recently did amazing research. I mean, they took a lot of the damage, the emotional damage from society for their findings. Luckily for us, it was a massive sacrifice. You got I can't remember his name now, but there's a Canadian professor that basically dug up the Roman bodies or found the remains and tested their bones and found that they had like
Mhm.
70 times more lead in their bones than we did. And he
Wow.
came up, I think he tied up the whole lead crime hypothesis. So part of the reason that lead was banned was because it turns people into criminals, violent criminals, basically.
Wow.
Um,
It
so
causes people to be a bit paranoid, is my what I've read on it. Like people get paranoid and kind of like have start having like delusions of and aggression. Is that what you've seen as well or read as
from
well?
the data suggests that it increases all sorts of like the most heinous crimes. So
Interesting.
when you think about these things, you have to again, there's primary, secondary, tertiary. So some people
Yeah.
will never get any psychological symptoms.
Yes.
Some people will get paranoia, like you said. Some people will become more territorial or anxious or scared of like someone else hurting them, like paranoia.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of contributors psychologically to crime, of course. So you've
Yes.
got some people are just turning to sadists, other are just fearful or paranoid. Some are just revenge. So it's sort of like
Mhm.
from looking at animal studies, it generally led lowers the territorial or the threshold for defending your territory in animals.
Oh,
So every single
interesting.
species that it was given to, they basically became fearful, territorial, more likely to attack an intruder, even if they were friendly, um, more violent generally. So the attack was more vicious,
Yeah,
which really explains the Roman Empire when you think about it that way. Um,
absolutely.
so I think, I'm not, I'm, I can't say I know for sure, but I'm fairly
Yeah.
confident. I'd be extremely surprised if the whole serial killer spike in the 70s in America wasn't because of lead directly. Because
Wow.
as soon as lead was banned, the serial killers just disappeared. In the 1920s,
Wow.
there was like 70 per 100,000. I think by the 1970s they 50x'd, I think. So that's 50 times
Wow.
more serial killers in the 70s, and then suddenly they disappeared after banning them. So you know, I think we call it the lead crime hypothesis because for the same reason we call evolution a theory. For me, I
Yeah.
believe in it like it's a fact.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Um, and
And
I'm
what
sure.
about,
Yeah.
oh, I was just gonna say, and what about the physiological effects? I think you mentioned cardiovascular disease and maybe some other things related to lead.
Yeah, so this is very recent stuff that I looked into, and cardiovascular disease definitely that's involved. Again, that's not to say that if you have cardiovascular disease, you're also a criminal or a sociopath, because
Of
it has different
course.
effects on different
Just
people.
like
So
you're
that's all
saying,
right.
yeah, it's gonna affect different people differently depending on genetics. Yeah.
Yeah, and the level of exposure and duration and all of that. But
Right.
whatever was in that leaded gasoline basically gave us the first cardiovascular disease epidemic in Western Europe and North America. And I think, my opinion, and I don't think it was just the lead. I think probably there were a bunch of hydrocarbons in there, other than lead, that contributed to it. But definitely, as soon as lead was stopped, cardiovascular disease just dropped immediately. But in fact, it dropped before we invented statins, before
Yeah.
balloon, so stents, ballooning, all that stuff, the angioplasty. Basically, there were no interventions whatsoever apart from maybe ECGs and maybe electro. I can't remember. They had some coronary units, but whatever they were doing was not nowhere near enough to even cause a dent in the rates.
Yeah.
So something we were definitely exposed to something that was then removed, and then cardiovascular disease started to vanish.
Wow. Wow.
And I
Yeah. I
think,
mean, it's just on every level, right? Neurotransmitters, hormones, physiological functioning of our tissues. I mean, these substances shift the expression of our genes just on the most fundamental level. So just all these different levels you're talking about is so fascinating to me.
yeah, yeah, exactly. And the thing is, the other problem we face in medicine or in healthcare in general is people can't seem to think of the brain as an organ because we're human, of course. And when you study yourself as a
Right.
human, you've got to really believe that you're some sort of alien and look at humans as some sort of intelligent monkey.
Right.
Otherwise, you're too involved. If you can't compartmentalize to that
Right.
extent, it's very difficult. But we weren't able to make the connection that a lot of these psychological symptoms are just another symptom in another organ of metabolic syndrome. Do you know what I mean?
Right.
Because cardiovascular disease really is type 2 diabetes, obesity, high blood pressure, kidney disease, and then psychological symptoms. So if we actually managed to take a more holistic approach, we would have figured out that it was one symptom or one syndrome that's caused by,
Yes.
um, you know, a pollutant.
And you have some really interesting ideas. I mean, speaking of the psychological aspect, and you kind of alluded to it when you're like, this explains the Roman Empire, of how potentially the shifts that these substances cause
Mm-hmm.
in whole groups of people actually change how cultures and civilizations are formed and how people relate to each other on these greater systemic levels and maybe even shift the course of history. So you have kind of this idea of like these different eons related to the toxicants that we're exposed to. Do you want to go a little bit into that?
Yeah,
I mean, obviously this is just an idea, right, that you're having with all your research, but I think it's a fascinating concept that ties a lot of this together.
yeah. I think this is why now I think this is not an emotional, or this is not an intellectual challenge. It's an emotional challenge, because
Right.
once you understand that the environment is basically, the earth is engineering us through the chemicals, and we are then creating whatever life we're creating, causing whatever problems we're causing, it becomes very difficult to blame yourself or other people. and
Mm,
and for you to reconcile that, it's not an intelligence thing, this is an emotional stability thing. So you
yeah.
have to basically be fully emotionally healed to then see it. And that's why when I first started posting on TikTok, when I first posted one of my theories about plastics, I thought to myself, I'm going to end up having to deal with a lot of, like, 20-year-old Joe Rogan type men, right? Because, like
Yeah.
Alex, whatever his name is, he talked about the frogs
Yeah.
and all that. But to
Oh,
my
yeah.
surprise, it was like middle-aged and younger, even spiritual women. 90% of the engagement on that video came from that side.
Interesting.
So I was like, what is going on? That's a huge surprise, right? And then I realized that I actually wasn't teaching them anything, because that's how
Hmm.
TikTok works. You get engagement from validation or um, entertainment value, but there was nothing entertaining about this theory. So it was validation. So basically, what I was doing is validating um, a belief of a group of people who'd already known this for a while, right?
Yes.
So and that's why the engagement came from there.
Okay, that's why
So
I must have found you in that audience. Yeah.
um, yeah, which was really interesting. And then yeah, basically, once you, this is again where you have to, at some point in my whole TikTok journey, I delved into the whole metaphysical thing or spiritual thing, because uh, if there's something in the environment that's engineering us, right, it becomes very important in the next part of the theorizing to to figure out intent, right? Because if there's intent behind the chemicals or the earth, then there might be a supernatural being or a supernatural
Hmm.
energy force. If there's no intent, it changes the whole picture, and the theory is affected, or the theorizing, at least the synthesis of the theory. So that's the reason why I explored that. It wasn't, some people
Yeah.
said I had a near death experience or something. That's definitely not the case. I was just trying
Okay.
to figure out why all the people that seem to know about this theory have also happen to be spiritual, and how did they get there before me? Because I'm considered crazy in some circles, in most circles in science, right? Because,
Okay. Yeah.
you know what I mean. If I'm on the fringes of science, and there are people in society who'd already figured this out, like I went in.
Right.
You know what I mean? Yeah. So
Yeah.
so
Well, it's people who are willing to look at the big picture and, like you said, really like let go. I don't know. It's like take responsibility, but let go of responsibility in the same way, right? Like you're looking at this from a very zoomed out perspective where it's like it's not so much about our individual like day-to-day behaviors, which is so tempting to like take that on. Not that those things don't have an impact, of course, but you're just zooming out to such an extent where you're more looking about these ages of the earth and how these greater trends in the way we're using the materials of the earth are affecting us. And that can definitely influence the choices that we make when we have that knowledge, but it also does kind of um release this sense of, you know, what am I trying to say here? Like, uh, feeling like you are somehow personally to blame for the experiences that you've had in your life. And I think that's relieving on one end, but also it takes the power out and you become like more like just another animal in the world. You become just another organism on the earth in this big complex universe.
absolutely, it takes away. If you're someone who's been working very hard and building a massive life, and you've poured in so much effort and anxiety into doing this work, and then you suddenly realize it doesn't even matter. Of course, you're going to have a reaction. There's
Yeah.
also the fact that there's accountability, and then there's blame. People have different coping mechanisms. Some probably you can argue are better than others or healthier than others. And if you're the kind of person who needs revenge or blame to
Yeah.
blame someone, or like it's eye for an eye type of justice, you might struggle with that as well. So
Yeah.
there are many reasons, I think, and it's it's just there's no other way. You have to stick with the truth because that's the only
Yeah.
thing we know. You know what I mean? There are different opinions on either side of the spectrum. So the only thing you have is the truth for you to stick with, and
Yeah.
if you stick with the truth, you're going to end up on the right side of history at some point or other. Hopefully, not sooner than later.
Yeah. Yeah. And if we see these huge trends for what they are and how much they're modulating our experience of ourselves and our culture, then I think it can give a certain kind of peace around like this is meant to be exactly what it is. And that's something I appreciate about the way you've kind of laid out the because I think that that post that first had a lot of those women discovery was talking about how this is a very feminine age of the earth with the kinds of substances that we're exposed to, you know, where it was very
Yeah,
more masculine dominant before with some more of the heavy metals. And with all the like wars and ideology and all the things like going on culturally right now, I feel like looking at this is not like you're not saying any of these things are bad or good. You're just saying like, look, this is what's happening. Like our environment, our earth, the materials we're using from the earth are shaping us and we're changing and we're shifting and it is what it is. You know,
yeah,
it's not to be one is not to be valued more than the other, but we need to understand it and accept it and learn how to navigate it. Am I
yeah.
getting that right?
You're absolutely
As your
exactly.
overall
That's
message?
exactly. No,
Yeah.
that's exactly what it was because that's exactly what I was trying to do. At least my message, yes,
Yeah.
because there's no running away from this. It's been happening for thousands of years, and if we're not careful, it's going to happen again. And who knows? Maybe somebody knows about it. Like some of this might be slightly intentional. We don't even know that, right? So it's very important, I think, that the sooner we make that realization, because look at what happened in medicine, right? That's 60 years. 60 years and no consensus on any of the conditions that are making our life hell or killing us even, right? That's cancer, cardiovascular disease, all autoimmune conditions. There's no cause. So how can you live for 60 years and create therapeutic targets if you don't know the cause of disease? So surely that alone is, every other issue um, takes, sorry, this takes precedent over any other issue, right? Because it's human
Yeah.
health. So
Yeah.
and environmental health as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I think for me, the reason why I was, a lot of people might disagree, but for me, the more I realized that this is less meaningful than it really is in terms of um, like the more I realized that our biology and psychology is more flimsy than I
Yeah.
previously thought. For me, that's more freeing. But I know some people
Yes.
struggle, and it's the opposite for some
Yeah.
people. But for me, it's more freeing because it means I'm less likely to hate someone, or I'm less likely to hold a grudge that's going to fester maybe over
Yeah.
something someone did to me, because now I know it's less their fault than I thought it was earlier. So for me,
Right.
it's very. I think for me, if you're holding a grudge against someone, or you've got this victim complex stuck in your head, which is fair after everything that's happened to
Yeah.
everyone. I think that hate never actually bothers the person you hate. It's all you. It might feel good temporarily.
Yeah.
It's almost like um, instant gratification.
Uh-huh.
So you might feel good hating on someone who's done something to you for a bit, but long term, there's no way there are no health consequences for that. Especially that we
Right.
know autoimmune disease is triggered by psychological issues quite often, or
Yeah.
trauma. So
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and you're not saying to just like give up either. I mean, you've said multiple times like there are ways to work with your psychology, like practice mindfulness and use the natural medicines that grow in our environments, like the medicinal herbs, and maybe even look to advances made, you know, in modern medicine to help make us have the best lives that we can given our context. And a lot of people, I mean, make remarkable recoveries as much as, you know, Western medicine wants to consider these conditions, you know, incurable. I mean, people recover every day using these kinds of techniques. And so but there's a bigger sense of like surrendering to like, this is the time you were born in, you know, this is how your environment has shaped you, you know, accept that, surrender to that, appreciate that, and then, you know, do what you can. And I
Exactly.
think that is such a healthier way to approach our overall health and daily life than being in this really constricted, like angsty, like revengeful, like whose fault is it place that I think a lot
Absolutely.
of people end up. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of healthcare professionals are part of the problem. Everybody's part of the problem. Everybody's the
Yeah.
same, really, whether you're a doctor, a
Yeah.
patient, or anyone in
Yeah.
between. So the equivalent of that is basically what science, when science talks about weight loss and type 2 diabetes and sugar and meat, right? This is something that for some reason is entirely unscientific, pseudoscientific even, but they still can't get rid of it. They can't get
Yeah.
rid of that mentality. You can't tell someone, like on a population level, if you look at a million people, a very small minority of exceptional people are actually able to maintain a low weight as they get older. The vast majority
Mm.
of humans will start getting more overweight from the age of 30
Yeah.
and continue to do so until 60. It's literally like an algorithm, right? We
Yeah.
also know, we've known for decades about leptin, ghrelin, all of these hormones. There are hormones that interact with our hypothalamus and other parts of our brain that are basically in charge of maintaining our appetite. And they're
Yeah.
very delicate. So I don't know if you've noticed before or other people have, but if you go and run for 2 hours, the things that you're going to crave to eat afterwards are going to be very different if you wake up in the morning after going out for a bunch of drinks, right? And the reason
Right.
that happens is because appetite is very tightly controlled, like any other physiological process, right?
Hmm.
So, so for a bunch of people, for the majority of the population, or 30% of the population, to suddenly become obese, you can't then turn around and say, well, actually, you should lose weight, or you should eat less sugar, or it's meat. All the meat eating that you're doing is causing cancer. There's something there that happened to those people physiologically that
Yep.
disrupted the appetite mechanism that then caused
Right.
a population level problem, which is a third
Yes.
of society now. So
Yes.
so that whole thing where doctors study to lose weight, and like everybody knows basic physics, right? Like
Right.
when they say calories in, calories out, or
Right.
energy is conserved, whatever. Everybody knows basic physics. It's not the lack of physics knowledge that's causing people to gain weight. Do you know what I mean? So
Right.
that whole thing is just brain dead, and I think there's some blame there.
Yeah, 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 such a great example. Yeah. But then we'd actually, if we really acknowledge these theories you have, then we'd actually have to start changing on a massive, like global scale, how we're engaging with our environment. I don't know if many people are ready for that.
I mean, to be fair, some people may already know because the EPA is doing a lot of work. Every single European agency has been consistently hounding all of these companies. But
Interesting. Yeah.
there's an invisible tight balance maintained between
Yeah,
economics and war and politics, and
exactly.
it's checks and balances. So if you push too hard too quickly, the consequences can be disastrous.
Right.
But
Yeah. Well, we've been talking for almost an hour. I want to respect your time. But I guess if there's any last message you want to share or what you want to summarize, what like a take-home message you really want people to get out of this interview today.
I think yeah, I think I keep an open mind basically in every aspect of there are things that or you've been taught for a fact to be true, almost like a religion, that will that turned out, at least for me, to be untrue, not even close to the truth.
Yeah.
So yes, always keep an open mind, always explore everything, no matter how insane it sounds to you on first expression. But that's it, I think.
Yeah.
Thank you so
Beautiful.
much,
I
by the way.
appreciate your time so much. Yes, this was an incredible conversation. I hopefully we can do it again.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's lovely to meet you.
All right. I'm going